So today we're going to hear about the impact of the pilot that we ran to really understand supporting and sharing of individual data sets in a generalist repository for which there is no community data repository available. You'll hear a little bit about how we looked at discovering and improving metadata and discovery catalog services and how we enhance our stewardship of these type of data. So next slide. Just as a background, I'm sure you've seen this slide before. NIH always encourages researchers to share their data in a domain-specific repository when it's possible. And if you're interested, these repositories are listed on the BMIC website. Today, we're going to focus on data sets for which there is no domain-specific repository. And so we had a pilot for 1 year to understand the landscape, the use, and the sharing of this data. Next slide. And this pilot is from Figshare. This is an image from our instance. You'll hear a lot about the data, the usability of that data, and the lessons that we've learned from this pilot. Next slide. Oh, that is it. So I think that is my way of being able to introduce Dr. Mark Hahnel. He's the founder and the CEO of Figshare, which was founded in 2012. Mark worked on this while he was working on his PhD in stem cell biology at Imperial College of London. So what a cool thing to do while you're working on your PhD. Clearly you saw a need for such a generalist repository. Mark is a strong advocate for open research and open data science. I really want to thank you, Mark, for coming to NIH today to speak with us about the pilot, the lessons learned, and some takeaway messages as we move forward in our data sharing landscape.
Thank you, Susan. Fantastic to be here. Thank you, everybody, for making the time. I will share my screen, and hopefully everybody can see my screen, and I can push on with talking a little bit about, as Susan mentioned, the pilot and how it's gone. I think I'll talk for about 30 minutes, so there will be time for questions if anybody has them at the end. I don't want to take up too much of your time. If anybody wants to follow up afterwards, get in touch at Mark Hahnel on Twitter. Alternatively, you can contact me at mark@figshare.com. Open data is a passion of the Figshare team and everything we do, so we're always happy to geek out on these things. And so it's been a privilege to work with the NIH on this pilot to understand exactly, to try and investigate with researchers where these gaps are, if there are any gaps. The idea that, as Susan just mentioned, all researchers should be making their data available in a subject-specific repository, but sometimes there isn't a subject-specific repository. And as Susan referred to, this is what happened to me. So, and that's why Figshare came about. So I'll talk a little bit about how we got here as Figshare, and specifically talk about the NIH Figshare instance and the pilot, what's available for researchers, what we found out, and some things that we started to tease into at this very early stage in policies around open data for NIH-funded research, and then where we're going. You can almost see the some of the data I'll show you at the beginning will show you can see where the arc of the ball is going to end up, and where we think the data space is moving, and where the gaps are, and where we can plug them. And so I did do a PhD in stem cell biology. From that, I generated lots of different outputs, lots of different files. I think when we talk about data now, we're really talking about the digital files created during research. So the biomedical sciences obviously lends itself very well to this space, but all research now has a lot of content that is being generated, and the traditional publication process doesn't really lend itself to publishing that content. So if we looked at me specifically back in 2011, I had a lot of FASTA sequences, some genomics files that I had GenBank for. So genomics has been a big advocate in the open data space, and I had a solution, so I had a place to make that data available. But I also had lots of videos of stem cells moving from one side of the screen to the other. And of those data videos, there was nowhere where I could make those videos available. I sent them off to publishers, but I had a lot of problems. Sorry, my mic's on this side. I'm just getting a bit of feedback in my headphones. The publishers could not publish these videos because they were too big. And these are talking about 5 megabyte files, but the infrastructure didn't support it. So I started making my own data sets and my own videos and my own data files available online. And the community led me into the best practice of things need to be persistent. Link rot is a real thing. And so from there, we ended up with Figshare.com, which is a free platform that any academic can come along, upload some files, add some metadata, and publish their outputs. So this is a generalist repository. This is for the 70% of files that don't have a home to live. In an ideal world, every subject, every file type would have a subject-specific repository, but that doesn't scale fantastically. And with the free version of Figshare, initially, we had a lot of people uploading spreadsheet data, videos like the one I talked about, but we also saw people sharing other types of research. So there's a real heterogeneity in the different types of that people are trying to publish. So this is still available today on freefigshare.com. But as the policies around data publishing have evolved, all of the boring stuff, all of the policy compliant infrastructure we build, when we started working with different organizations, a lot of organizations had tried to build their own systems. And then at some point, it just becomes a core service. At some point, there is too much new development to build in order for it to not make sense to just use somebody else to build that infrastructure for you. So we have the Figshare infrastructure is ISO certified. It has WCAG 2.1 AA certification, so accessibility for those with web readers and things like this for disabilities. This is very important stuff that's often neglected by academic infrastructure. And so we started working with organizations who needed data publishing infrastructure to provide this enterprise offering, making sure that everything was indexed in Google Scholar or Google Dataset Search, things like this. And it's important. Policy compliant infrastructure is really important when we work with hundreds of universities and lots of funders around the world. And there's always a use case of, well, the data needs to live here. So if the data needs to live or the infrastructure needs to live on GovCloud approved infrastructure in America, we can perform that. So there's a lot of ticking boxes. And that's very useful because it aids the persistence of the data. And this is one of the reasons why when the NIH put out the call for the NIH Generalist Repository Pilot, Figshare is a part of digital science, which builds tools for researchers. So we have Overleaf and Altmetric and Dimensions, a lot of the folks at the NIH might be familiar with. So we already had this pre-competed IDIQ contract that we can jump on. So it makes contracting and help to get services and infrastructure quickly very easy. That said, you can see an example of a couple of examples of organizations that we work with here. On the left-hand side, you can see HHMI and Genelia, who are very focused on specific types of research because they're a focused organization. And on the right-hand side, you see Carnegie Mellon, their institutional data repository, where lots of data sets are being made available, but it's a broader thematic reach. So one thing was important in the building policy compliant infrastructure. You also need to be able to be adaptable to the needs when it comes to licensing issues, when it comes to metadata schemas. So we often work with the organizations to make sure that the infrastructure we're providing is ticking the boxes. And that's very important in terms of the metadata that we captured and the checks that we did on the NIH pilot, which I'll be talking about in a little moment. I wanted to start with some of Figshare's core beliefs as an organization, because I think this is very important in setting the scene. We are big believers in the fact that academic research output should be as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. If you'd have got me in 2010, I was shouting about everything needs to be open. But the more and more you see the edge cases within the space, the more and more you see that clinical trial data needs access control. And this is the functionality that we're building out now, is that more options for requesting access to data or controlling the access to the data from the organization. But if you read through some of these other ones, identifiers for everything, I think this has been, with the technology boom in academia, I think identifiers for everything has made large organizational queries much easier to process. If you have, everybody has an ORCID. We have organizational identifiers in GRID or ROR. We have DataCite DOIs for data sets. We have Crossref DOIs for papers. So now you really can say, this person with this ORCID, with this grant code, with this, from this university published this research, which was these papers and this data. And you can really start asking questions of the data in a programmatic way, which wasn't possible previously. The final thing on the kind of work we do at Figshare is we also do a lot of research on understanding how researchers are changing their habits when it comes to data. And we do a report every year. We've done it for the last 4 years, called the State of Open Data. It's very easily Googleable. The last one, it comes out in October every year. The last one had 8.5 survey responses. And we also have a few thought leadership pieces from people in the space globally. And I'll refer to some of the findings from the State of Open Data over the years, because it helps frame some of the conversation here. But you can see, while most trends are encouraging around the adoption and acceptance of open data, the research community is now demanding more enforcement of the mandates that have been adopted by many governments, funders, publishers, and institutions around the world. And most of the researchers felt that they did not get sufficient credit for sharing their data. And so these two things will be consistent over the next 30 minutes. Credit for data publishing and complying with policies and mandates from their funders. Almost like a carrot and a stick approach, and how we've seen this dual pressure lead more and more people making their data available. And now we need to start thinking about how this operates at scale, which is why the NIH Generalist Repository Pilot is really the first dive into this, understanding how NIH researchers, where the gaps are and what needs plugging. So we look at a few of the survey responses over time, again, looking at carrots and sticks. We find that the vast majority, 68% here and 10% here, value data citations the same amount as they value citations to an article. So impact of research is really valuable for encouraging researchers to make their data available, by tracking that, by giving them a way to track the impact of their data sets. On the flip side to that, the stick side to that, we also asked, what should funders make the sharing of research to part of their requirements for awarding grants? And this was quite a shocking result. Nearly 70% of researchers said that funders should be making us make our data available. But probably more surprising was the second half of that question, which was, should funders withhold funding from or penalize in other ways researchers who do not share their data if the funder has mandated them to do so? And 66.5%, 2/3 of the researchers said yes, they should be penalized. And obviously, that's a strange concept. But when you dig a bit deeper, what's actually happening is academia is competitive. You are competing with your peers for funding, for prestige that leads to funding, and many other things. So you don't want to be making your data available and providing a benefit to your colleagues and your peers if they're not making their data available so you get the same benefit. So going all the way to the top and have mandated at the funder level means that everybody is on the same starting point. And so this idea of preferential treatment or people not wanting to share data because they want to get ahead of their competitors is removed. So this is really interesting to see how the shape of researchers' thoughts were last year. The State of Open Data Survey is out now for 2020, and it'll be out in October. So this idea of motivating researchers, I showed you some examples of what Figshare.com, the free version, had at the beginning in terms of we accept any file format and we aim to preview it in the browser. And one thing that's nice is this idea that as everything is becoming more computational, if you do have a 3D dinosaur's tooth to publish, you can do that now. If you do have a Jupyter notebook, you can publish it and people can interrogate it in the format that it was produced. You don't have to convert it into different file formats. The different side of this, though, is understanding what do we mean in terms of if we want to scale this up, how do you ascertain any quality? How do you know this is good content? How do I know this is useful to me? And so obviously peer reviewing a paper is very different to checking a dinosaur tooth or a Jupyter notebook. So something to think about there. But we do track citation counts. For every output that's published through our infrastructure, we track views, downloads, citation counts out of the box. And we use our sister company, Altmetric. Those, as you can see with this example, where it's got a lot of attention, but no citations. There's often a 2-year citation lag with academia. But you can see that the attention around this research output is being picked up by the news. It's referenced in Wikipedia. It can also help you find collaborators, see who's talking about your work. So there's a few different levels in which we can look at, I don't want to say impact per se, but citations are often a good indicator of reuse of content, whether it's data or papers. A secondary thing that's come out recently is this idea that if you make your data sets available, you can get impact for your data sets and get citations for those. If you make, this is a study that came out in April, and it looked at PLOS and BMC papers, and it was 500,000 papers, and it looked at the citation counts reference to whether there was a data availability statement and whether researchers are linking out to a repository saying, here is the data you need to back up this paper or to reproduce it. And what they found was on those 500,000 papers that if you had a data availability statement and made your data set available in a repository, there was a 25% increase in the citations to the paper. So it's compounding impact. You have the data sets getting impact, but also the paper getting more impact as well. So this is leading to this combined with what we see at the funder level. There are now 85 publishers globally who mandate data publishing as part of the research they fund. And we've seen this grow over time with, from 2013, the OSTP memo and the Obama administration. And then in January 2019, the Open Government Data Act from the Trump administration, which had requires US federal agencies to publish all non-sensitive government information, including federally funded research, as open data. So we need to think about this double pressure and what it leads to. And here you can see generalist repositories. So Figshare is in there, but there's also a few other ones that you use as well. And you can see this hockey stick of papers linking to these generalist repositories. As Susan said, as I mentioned at the beginning, the message is always, if there is a subject-specific repository, use that one. If not, you still should be making your data available and the generalist repositories to do that. If you cumulatively look at these links from papers to generalist repositories, you see this hockey stick. This was taken the other day, and you'll see that we're nearly at 20,000 for 2020, so it's going to be up here. So this really bodes well for data being made available, but it also suggests that we're going to have to deal with this at scale. And so remember what I was saying about infrastructure is all good and looking after the policy compliance infrastructure, but when it comes to checking these files and understanding the quality, this is a new area for a lot of folks. And so I think I would be remiss to not comment on the current climate and this idea that there's a very big interest in the moment for fast publishing, but good publishing. And this is not just in data, this is in preprints. We see it with COVID, that this is a white paper that Digital Science put out, and the CEO of Digital Science, Daniel Hook, had these comments about how COVID-19 is changing research culture. So at the top, you can see all of this new content is being published very fast, whether it's clinical
8 hours and 27 minutes before I go to bed.
Whether it's clinical trials or scholarly articles, grants, all of this funding around COVID research is happening very fast. So you've seen it with preprints, people wanting to publish preprints and then the news picking them up and it's not being peer reviewed. So the response has been immediate and intensive. The research world has moved faster than anyone would have suspected possible. From peer review to scholarly search, we're seeing changes in behavior condensed into a few months that have long been campaigned for. And there's a reason that they've been long campaigned for. I mentioned the State of Open Data report that we have now. We have some sneak preview data of this year's data where we had some COVID questions. And this is saying the reuse of research data is likely to increase from pre-COVID-19 levels. So this is some preliminary data. On the left, you can see academics making use of their own data or other people's data. You can see that when they have done already, or they're likely to in the state of lockdown, or they're likely to over the next 12 to 18 months, particularly on the other people's data, people are going to be making more use of other people's data to hopefully move further, faster, to collaborate with their peers. And so I'm just going to get a little bit hypothetical before jumping into the facts of the NIH pilot. Here, when I want to take a step back and think, why is data important? Why is open data important when we talk about research, academia, finding discovery? So again, you can look at COVID, or you can look at any other biomedical research that's looking for a treatment, that's looking for an improvement in quality of life. You have these 3 labs who are all working away. It's on a time scale. So at the bottom here, you can see from left to right is time progressing. And each dot is a discovery in the lab. So, and each dotted line is someone building on top of that discovery. So you have it with papers already. If the paper is openly available, you can build on top of it. If the data set is openly available, you can query it, you can build on top of that, pull it into your research. And what happens is you end up with lab 2 here, taking some data from lab 1 and lab 3 and getting to this new treatment. If any of these lines break down, if any time they can't build on top of that data from their collaborators or their peers, then this treatment moves further to the right. And if we're talking about COVID, it's more people dying. If we're talking about lots of other treatments, it's different qualities of life. So you really want to be, academia works, but we can make it, we want to really move further, faster in order to make it work more efficiently. And so when we say, well, that's great, what are the barriers to this? Well, when I said if the data wasn't available, how often is that the case? How often do these dotted lines break down? This is a random journal. I didn't mean to pick on them. I picked it up. I did a quick search. It's being published in December 2020, which is fascinating to me. And you can see that it's a COVID paper. And when you go to the availability of data and materials, all data are available and upon request. So when I say how hard is it for one of these lines to break down, it's not even an active decision. It's passive. They don't need to reply to that email. One of these dotted lines breaks down, the treatment moves to the right, people die. So let's focus on what all this means for the NIH Figshare instance coming into this a year ago in July the 23rd last year. We got things up and running for them very quickly. The NIH working group had some things that they wanted that came out of the box from Figshare. So you can read these faster than I can say them, but the ability to assign an NIH specific DOI, that was in there. Usage metrics tracked openly, I've already talked about some of that. Embargoes, things like this. Fair implementation, I'll touch on a bit more. I think most people know on this call have probably heard about FAIR, but I don't mean to patronize, but findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. It's a set of principles that say, if all data is made available in this way, then we could really, then you don't need to rely on emailing authors and asking them for their data. The things on the right here, the expert guidance and metadata improvement, documenting with NIH custom metadata, as I say, the aim at the beginning here was for findable, accessible, making the data available in a way that a lot of researchers haven't had to do before. So it's a new thing for a lot of researchers. From the free Figshare.com, from our generic platform, we see a lot of researchers every day. There is no expert guidance and checks done there. There is no freely available generalist repository for academics to publish their data in with those checks being made. And so you're relying, you can nudge them into best behavior, but it's very hard sometimes when researchers will call their data set table 1. And table 1 is not findable. You can't Google table 1 and find that data set. And support for large files is an interesting one as well, because we're seeing things get bigger as everything gets more computational. So to touch on the FAIR side of things, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, when I talk about research, this is being a new field, data publishing for researchers, if we refer back to our state of open data, we see that in spite of many initiatives, on the top right, you see logos of some great initiatives looking at helping researchers make data fair or as fair as possible. If we look at the actual surveyed surveys, researchers, you know, in 2018, 59% of people didn't know what FAIR was. Researchers responding to a data survey. 2019, 54%. So it's getting better, but it still shows that this is very new and there's a lot of hand-holding that needs to be done. And this was one of the requirements of the pilot, see how much hand-holding needs to be done. So this is this idea that one of the hypotheses, a lot of what I'm talking about is the opinions of Mark and Figshare and not obviously the NIH group. But I've always thought that if you had some data and you had some policy compliant infrastructure like the stuff that Figshare provides, and like Figshare did for this NIH pilot, you can get to findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for humans, but only findable and accessible for machines. It really needs a human to quantify whether this is reusable. And so this is what we were thinking about with, if you add in data librarians to check the files, you can really go very deep into reproducibility for machines. You can imagine a lot of researchers, if you're talking about a very subject specific piece of data that needs to be reproducible, it can take days. And so with the pilot, what the NIH was looking at doing is having researchers go to a place, know about a place where it's for NIH-funded researchers, if they don't have a subject-specific repository, to submit their data files, have them checked and the metadata improved. So focused on the first two here, that findability and accessibility, so it scales well, and have it published with NIH DOIs in an NIH Generalist Repository indexed in many places. So as part of the review process, some of the checks that were done, this was defined on the website and with the team, things like the files match the description, can be opened and are documented, along with the metadata sufficiently describes the data. That was really important to see if people were describing data well so that other people could really reuse it. Other things like no personally identifiable information, making sure that the NIH funding is hard linked so you can query it in a programmatic way, as I said before, identifiers for everything. So there was a set of standard checks that were done by our team. So this was the outcome. There was a NIH.figshare.com, the NIH Figshare instance, and we had a lot of researchers making their data available. And when they came here, different to Figshare.com or other generalist repositories, they had a data expert to help them out and offer them advice from the moment they signed up. You could group the content together in many different ways. You can have individual files with individual metadata in one DOI. You can have multiple files that are the same experiment, so the same metadata in the same DOI. And then you could group things together. So lots of files with individual metadata, all part of a bigger project. So we can see what that looks like here. Well-described metadata, NIH DOI, some citations and altmetric tracking, some files. But we also saw examples of people who were publishing, in this case, videos, where we had very well-described individual videos, but also the collection of the videos of the perforin 2 pre-pause and pause, where the collection itself had well-described metadata, both of them editable, both of them you can track via their DOIs, their NIH DOIs. In terms of engagement, throughout the NIH Figshare instance pilot, members from the Figshare team worked together with members of the NIH team to coordinate communication, outreach, and training activities for the research community. The Figshare team conducted regular webinars on using NIH Figshare targeted to specific communities, including biomedical researchers, NIH intramural researchers, and academic librarians. And we also conducted a number of email campaigns to NIH users and the wider community. Within the days around the webinars and the email campaigns, we observed a number of NIH Figshare user accounts being created. So this is where I'm saying this can potentially be attributed to this outreach activity. We can start inferring some ideas around what is causing success. So again, very happy to talk at more length about some of these details of engaging researchers. As things went on as well, when people sent us questions, we'd improve the FAQs so people could the information that was there for them. We created user guides. We created information for researchers and for librarians, because there's a whole lot of education that needs to be done in this space. So let's have a look at the numbers on the NIH Figshare instance. There's a lot to take in here, so I'll focus on a few of the highlights. As I said, I'm more than happy to discuss in more detail some of these things. Fantastically, we saw 22 NIH institutes and centers represented. We've seen already in it's 12 months today since the pilot started, 35 citations of the data sets. So I mentioned that there is a lag in terms of citations of research outputs, whether it's papers or data. What's fantastic to see is so many citations already in the published literature. And although the pilot has ended, the repository will live on as an archive. So people will still be able to discover that content. The metrics will still be tracked. So we'll start to investigate whether there is actually any reuse, whether it's people self-citing their own data sets. It's a good test corpus of information. In terms of the public items and storage over time, it's as you'd expect, really. It grows over time. Things take a while to get embedded into communities, to change their workflows, to find out about these new tools available to them and have the data ready to publish at that point. So it's no surprise that our last full month had the most amount of public items being made available as more and more people heard about it, and we had people coming back and reusing it. We also saw a kind of exponential growth curve on the amount of data being used over time. I'll touch a little bit more on the size of the data because it's really interesting to see where that fits in comparison to other repositories. I mentioned that the NIH Figshare public items were supported by 22 out of the 28 NIH institute centers and offices. So you can see that NIAID had lots of the data sets, but you can see if you're from a different department, you can see that how your organization was making use of it. Interestingly, we saw a lot of intramural researchers making use of it. More external, 78% external research, extramural researchers. But if you look at the amount of funding that goes into those two different camps, I'm pretty sure that 22 is a high number. Again, we can hypothesize at this point because it's just a 12-month pilot. But whereas Carnegie Mellon and Genelia, the two I highlighted before, are universities or organizations that are providing that support for their researchers. Intramural researchers may not have that institutional data repository to make their data available. So this seemed to be a gap that was being plugged for them. In terms of views and downloads over time, again, this exponential growth with regards to the views and the downloads. We see this as a common thing as search index discovery gets better, as more people, there's more content, so there's more people to discover it. That was as we'd expected over time, growing consistently. When the researchers, when we had the NIH Figshare instance set up and we had somebody checking the metadata in order to improve the metadata, this was a very unique situation that I don't think there's been, we've been able to compare in the past, which is, can you take apples for apples data sets and compare what metadata improvement does to the fairness of the data? And so if we look at just people who signed up for the NIH Figshare instance and made their data available, had that data librarian expertise to help them have that conversation, licenses, explain how to describe their data well, encourage them to do that. Whereas on the free generalist Figshare, figshare.com, there's nobody to help you do that. And so we often see very light metadata. But what we can see is we also saw during the same period, people uploading data onto figshare.com, the free version, with NIH funding, where they listed that they were NIH funded. So they should have been using the free service. So raising awareness on that level is always a battle, right? There's always new tools. So what we did see, though, is as expected when you've got someone enhancing the metadata, is much more descriptive metadata. So in terms of the average characters on the item title or on the description, it's huge improvement in the amount of depth of the metadata. And then look at what this means for actual reuse over time and impact. As we say, we're 12 months in today, so we can see how this will change over time. But in terms of views and downloads, it looks like items that had been well described using an expert on the NIH Figshare instance are more discoverable, and therefore there's more views and downloads of them. Obviously too early to tell on things like citations, but as I mentioned, it'll live on and we can come back to that. The average storage per item was a real surprise. Average storage size, we saw it was 8 times the size of Generalist Repository dataset uploads. And that could have been done something to do with the framing from the NIH, that you have this under 2 gigabytes goes to PubMed Central. You've got petabytes, it goes to Strides, but this kind of 200 to 500 gigabyte data set range is really where you see a big gap, and I'll touch on that a bit more in a moment as well. Again, early indications of good practice. We were delighted to see, as I mentioned at the beginning, you can customize the metadata that you want to capture. You want it to be a very thematic, subject-specific repository. Figshare infrastructure can provide for that. If you want it to be very generic, we can do that too. But one of the things that is an option is what licenses you want to allow people to make their research openly available under. And so it was really encouraging that given all of these different license options, the bottom 3 are code, the top 4 are Creative Commons, and the green and turquoise are a little bit more restrictive. And so what we found when we refer back to the state of open data is that the percentage of researchers who have no idea what they're doing when it comes to licensing data, because when have I ever learned about licensing data during my undergrad? We saw that particularly people who've been in academia for longer, over 70% of researchers didn't know what license to use. So by having somebody make, and what we often see there is people use the most restrictive license. So by having someone to help hold your hand. It was really encouraging to see the vast majority of researchers use very low restrictive open policies and for humans and for machines. So that was great. The numbers in context, just looking at comparing the NIH Figshare instance to other similar scoping projects that Figshare has powered, you can see the purple numbers here when comparing to a couple of universities are tracking about the same kind of pattern. So NIH Figshare instance, obviously NIH is bigger than institutions. So as you'd expect, it's got more public items at this time point. And you can imagine it would track up and to the right in a similar way to these universities. Perhaps more interesting is this is the same plot when we're looking at the size of the data that's being stored. So on the left-hand side here, you can't see the red or the green because these institutional data repositories aren't storing that much data. But I mentioned that this large data file needing to put it somewhere and having nowhere to put it seemed to be a real gap filler. So the NIH Figshare instance had huge amounts of data, 1,500 gigabytes of data being made publicly available relative to other data repositories in the space. So I'm going to wrap up here. Hopefully I haven't taken up too much time. There's still time for questions. Some of the key takeaways that we found from the project is there is a need for a generalist repository resource for the products of NIH-funded research that do not fit into a discipline-specific repository or require significant storage. Intramural researchers especially have a need for generalist repository as they do not have institutional sponsored or supported data repository to use. Subject human curator or team of curators is needed to check the files and improve the fairness of metadata. Who pays? Who checks how much is a big thing that we'll need to be thinking about as a community as this scales exponentially. And the key features of the NIH Figshare instance for researchers seem to be this easy self-deposit of data and documentation, acceptance of these files in any file format, the ability to share that wide range of research products, and an openly documented APIs to support integrations. So when we talk about fair repositories need open APIs. We did have this case where a researcher built his own application to transfer data from Amazon into the NIH Figshare instance, which was fantastic to see. It's available for everyone else. And there are some key features of the NIH Figshare instance. So the custom metadata fields, including that NIH Institute and Center information. Checking the funding IDs is important because it's the thing that researchers get wrong a lot. They spell it wrong, they put it in wrong. Indexing and search engines and citable DOIs with openly tracked metrics of attention are important for researchers to get credit, for the NIH to measure the impact of their own research. So if you need to do that. Promotion leads to uptake, hardly surprising. And it's a new thing. So it takes a long time for researchers to get used to a new thing and adapt their lab workflows. So as I mentioned, there is a bigger goal at stake here when we get tied down with policies. So do think about that when you're sharing your data or thinking about policies at your own organization. And if anybody would like to talk more about this, if there's not time today, please do get in touch at this email address. But thank you for your attention, and I'll stop here if there's any questions.